But, just give us the spiel, Therese.
I am Therese. I am a lawyer. I am an ex-corporate finance lady, and I'm a full-time feminist content creator. And I have done 2 long-form series. The first one was Red Pill Nation, and the latest one is called Witches, Whores, and Rebels. And it is about how patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy worked together in order to bring us to the point that we are now. It's about how the witch hunts were used by the ruling classes to break class solidarity among the peasants, to realign women's labor and recapture it into the home, to solidify that system so that their primary responsibility would be the reproduction of the workforce and nothing else. And also, it has action steps on where we move forward from here. So it's sort of like I bring you full circle with all of this stuff. People ask me, like, how did you think of the series? First, the title was workshopped a lot. Because
great.
We were like,
no, great.
And I was like, what if I just called it Witches, Whores, and Rebels? And I was almost joking. She's like,
that's the one.
That's
yes.
Right. So that's what I came up with. The series is the original idea for it came about in a time when I was really starting to interrogate my politics and interrogate my feminism. A couple of years ago, I read an article that was published on the American Enterprise Institute's website. As some of you probably know, that's a conservative think tank. And they had this article. It was called like The Rise of the Woke Single Woman, or The Rise of the Woke Single Voter, or something. Right. So I was reading this article, and all this time we think that when we talk to conservatives, we think to ourselves, well, if only they knew. If only they knew the facts, then clearly they would side with us. That just means they're ignorant and they don't know. But in reading these conservative think tanks, the writings that come from these own institutions, oh, honey, they know. They know, because they are getting very freaked out. And this was 2 years ago, and this data even dates back, like a decade ago. They were starting to notice this. They know that single women vote very differently than married women. Yep. And so the rise of the single, woke, and young Democratic Union, that's what it was. So they were talking about the differences between single women and married women, how they vote. And this is why they're trying to get women married young, because they noticed that the attitudes that most distinguish single women from other voters from their own survey data shows that married men and women are far more likely than unmarried. They use the word females here, which is telling. Married men and women and single females.
Boo.
Wonder. They are more likely to think that women are well treated or equally treated, versus single women see themselves and their fates linked to other women. And that is why they want to get you married, because they know that the longer you stay single, the longer you are going to see your fate tied up with the fate of other women. And that's going to cause you to vote more progressively.
Quick question. So you said that they see married women think that all women are treated equally, or they think that they're treated better?
They're more likely to think that women in general are treated equally. Basically, like feminism isn't needed, like that kind of stuff. Like, oh, everything's fine. We're great. I have a job and a check account. What's wrong? It's like paradise up in here. But yeah, but when you read these organizations' own information, you realize that, oh, they know that this system is shit. They know that marriage sucks for women. They know that working in this country for most people, most wage earners, is absolute shit. They know that healthcare is crazy expensive. They don't care. Because the year after I read this article, I was on a TikTok live and a woman suggested the name of a book called Caliban and the Witch. And that book blew my fucking mind.
I'll write it down. Blew
my mind. It is called, I can hold it up, so I got it right here. Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation.
Wow.
That is what it is called. And reading this book, I first thought, what the fuck is primitive accumulation? I'd read some, it sounded like a very academic term. I'd read some Karl Marx and some Engels, and just before that, I had read The Origins of Private Property, Family, and the State. That's a good one. And so I looked it up, and basically what it is a Marxist term. It means the historical process of separating people from the means of production. That's what it is. That's what primitive accumulation is. So then I thought about it, and then when Roe was overturned, I was like, this is happening right now. We are in another process of primitive accumulation, because when capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, when they feel their grip loosening, they hoard more. Roll back women's rights, roll back voting rights for black people, keep the minimum wage low, make healthcare even more expensive, because they're trying to accumulate more and more and more to separate us further and further and further from the means of production, to make us more desperate, and so they can control us more easily. And that is essentially what the witch hunts were. Because you had these little communities all over Europe, these villages, basically village life, and there was like a town center, and in these villages, especially in England and Germany, you had many women involved in the marketplace, involved in trade. You had, at one time in Florence, you had women controlling something like 40% of the private wealth in sometime in the 1500s. In England, if you look at the guild records in London, something like a third of the stalls at the biggest marketplace were owned by women. There was a very successful female entrepreneur in London that couldn't even read. She couldn't even read, and she was just like a full-on total badass. And that doesn't even include the Beguines, that basically lived in a feminist commune, 250,000 women strong, scattered all over the Flanders area. They dominated the wool trade for decades. So the men saw this trend of women getting involved in the marketplace. The village healers were women. The people at the community looked to. The people leading the protests against feudalism and against the landlords and protesting the rents and the enclosures. Those things were all led by women. And they looked around and said, this is a problem because we want to make some money. So the witch hunts did a handful of things. They destroyed economic class solidarity because they made people fear women and fear each other. So when it came to the landlords or the governor or something putting their foot down on something, people got to the point where they were very afraid. And they were afraid to speak out. They were afraid to protest. And peasant protests during that time were no small thing. They would literally roll up to the Lord's house with pitchforks and whatever, lower the rents. And they would pull the fences down of the enclosures that were privatized and just go back on the land. They would, and people kept doing that actually throughout, but there literally are gangs of peasants would do these things. So it turned men against women in a very specific way, though. It made, for the first time in a very specific way, it made men fear women in a way they hadn't before. It made women suspicious. It solidified these ideas that we have now that are very popular among the red pillars, that women are more emotional, that they're not as intelligent, that we're more prone to demonic influence, that we're sexually promiscuous, and we have this uncontrollable sex drive that has to be contained, and that's why the devil can come in so quickly. You literally hear men talking this way right now, and we can trace all of those ideas back to this time period. Yes. So that's when I really started to see the connection between that event, those events, and the red pill, which is what I talked about in my first series. And I made a timeline. There's a companion document to the series, by the way, that has a bunch of information. I made this timeline that showed the overlap of all these things: transatlantic slavery, European witch hunts, enclosures, colonization, all of these things. If you look at a bar graph, all those things, they overlap almost completely.
That's insane.
That was the biggest act. That period was the biggest act of primitive accumulation we had probably seen up until that time. I don't know if anything still yet surpasses it.
Is it basically so cumulative primitive accumulation is basically the old time version of like a wealth transfer? Like, is that what we would call a wealth transfer these days? Okay.
Yeah, it includes everything from like land theft to taking people's rights, voting, everything. Anything that separates people from resources, separates them from the means of production, that is part of primitive accumulation. It includes all of those things.
And when we think about the Salem witch trials, for an example, wasn't that, if I remember correctly, they were like coming up with these laws in order to, the women who owned land or something like that, they were coming up with ways to get the women to lose their land, put them in jail or put them somewhere so that they could take over their land or something like that.
Massachusetts Bay Colony at the time, the law said that if you were indicted for witchcraft, and you were convicted, your land was forfeited to the colony.
Yeah.
So there's that very famous story, which I didn't include the series, but it's a story about Giles Corey. You might have heard the story, the pressing of Giles Corey. Giles Corey and his wife were both accused of witchcraft in Salem back in the day, right? And he knew that once the charges were presented to him and he was asked to enter a plea, those of you who know about criminal law, you know that when you enter a plea, that's the process that begins where like the process has begun, and like that's when double jeopardy attaches. That's when all these things. So entering a plea is the beginning of that process, and he knew that he was not going to escape the charges. And his wife was already doomed for the gallows, so he knew he couldn't save his wife, so he just never answered the charges. When they said, "How do you plead?" he just said nothing. And then so they took him to the town square. They put a bunch of heavy rocks on him, and like, they weighed down his body. And they just kept asking him, "How do you plead? How do you answer these charges?" And he just said, "More stones, more stones." Took the dude 3 days to die. But he did that for a reason, because he knew that the minute he answered the charges, his property would be forfeited, his kids would be destitute. And the one thing he did manage to do was preserve his property for his children. So his children did inherit, and they did not, they weren't destitute. So all this to say, many of the witch trials, all of the witch trials had nothing really to do with witchcraft, but many of them had to do with property, particularly the ones in North America. There were women who were widows and who had inherited property that the state wanted. And as it happens, the sheriff in Salem at that time ended up living in the house of one of the people he prosecuted.
That's crazy.
He literally moved into the house when they
That was the whole point.
That's the whole point. By the way, that house is haunted as fuck, and I think it's like a boutique hotel now.
Really?
Or something.
Wow.
It's like, I think it is. I remember that on the walking tour when I went to Salem a couple years ago. But what you also have to remember about the witch trials, going back to the ones in Europe, is that you'll notice that in places where women really weren't that involved in economics and commerce, places where there wasn't a tradition of that, places where there were no land enclosures, there was no large theft of public land, no witch trials. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. And the places where they had the most witch trials was Germany. And Germany, like the strong European economy it is today, has always had a pretty strong, robust economy. I mean, there's a reason why queer people moved there in the 20s, because it was the best place to be at that time when you were queer. It was super cosmopolitan place, and it had always been a place where women had participated in the marketplace even back to like the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And that was the place where the majority of the witches were executed, Germany.
And wasn't it true that you just had to be accused of witchcraft? You didn't even have to actually be doing it.
How do you hold a trial?
Yeah, and then the witchcraft was considered stuff like figuring out what certain plants could do. Like aloe vera could like heal a burn, and that's considered witchcraft. Like, really?
Yeah.
There was a woman who, first of all, they allowed something called spectral evidence, which spectral evidence was like, I had a dream that I saw Goody Johnson dancing with other witches in the woods.
And that's it.
I saw her spirit over there while she was in the town square, selling like bonkers.
They could just make up some shit.
And your neighbors, one woman in particular, I lost on her name, but one woman in particular I talk about, her neighbors testified, and this was the literal evidence against her, that she was suspected for being a witch because, wait for it, she was happy being single.
Okay.
She was unmarried, and she had received apparently many generous offers from various gentlemen in town to marry her, to which she said no to all of them. She was happy being unmarried, and she was good at managing a household, and she was good with figures. She was happy and good with math, so she had to die.
Yeah.
That was the witchcraft.
Yeah.
Just doing normal things as a human.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when men do it, nobody cares.
No one cares. Absolutely no one.
Okay, so can we get into more how this like ties to the 19th Amendment, and how like, because in my mind that's kind of the first step is to like dehumanizing somebody, is like taking away their rights. I mean, we already had Roe v. Wade taken, and now people, especially after the New York City and the Seattle mayoral elections, people are really starting to call for this. Mostly pastors for now, obviously, but they're like, repealing the 19th is basically like a must at this point. Like these women are gonna vote us into a socialist hellscape, and nobody's gonna have food, and there's gonna be bread lines and all that. So what are the connections there?
Notice the language that they are using when they talk about this. Women are dumb. Women are too emotional. Women can't be trusted. Politics isn't for women. Politics is war. One guy said, I think it was Joel Webben. Politics is war. And women weren't built for war. Women were built to be nurturing, soft little people and pinch the cheeks of infants and toddlers. They're using the same reasoning and almost the same language verbatim that was used against women 500 years ago.
That's
when
insane.
you look, you could pull passages directly from the Malleus Maleficarum, depending on the translation. By the way, the Malleus Maleficarum is a book. The Malleus Maleficarum, it's translated to the Hammer of Witches, but really I read that a more accurate translation is the Hammer against female witches. So in particular, Heinrich Kramer, the priest who authored it, was after female witches.
He was an incel.
Yeah, he was basically an incel. Yeah, I go through a whole story about that. I'm not going to tell you, you gotta watch the series and go through the whole story. But I'm not the only woman that figured this out, so you might have heard this story before. But anyway, you could pull passages from the Malleus Maleficarum and map them directly onto the language about the 19th Amendment, about abortion, particularly the focus. They always managed, even apart from the Zohar Mamdani voting for a socialist thing, they always managed to bring abortion into the criticism. They always bring it in, even if it has
they're killing
nothing to do with
babies.
it. They're killing white women, if they're not killing their own babies, they're voting for socialists. All of those things, all that language they use. Women can't even be trusted with their own babies. That's why we
With
need
their
to
own
watch
bodies.
them. We need to monitor who's pregnant, and they did that in the 15th and 16th
Does that
century.
sound familiar?
Evie
Yeah.
has a new app, 28, that Peter Thiel is backing, that's tracking your
Perfect.
period.
Yeah.
All
Awesome.
of these things are happening, and they're using almost the same language. That's the weird thing. It's exactly. And I can't fathom how people can't see it. Like, I guess most people just don't have even a cursory knowledge of history, and they aren't aware that the arguments we use against women today are the same arguments we've always used. And you can even trace this back to the garden. Like,
Yeah, I keep saying this.
We just
we have
literally.
we have a religious tradition that literally blames women for the fall of humankind. Did we expect to have a culture that actually likes women
Right.
after that? Fuck no.
No, yeah.
Which is all made up, by the way.
Totally made
Not
up.
even real. That's the
Not
craziest
real.
part. We got people literally out here living their lives as if the Noah's Ark actually happened. As if
My
Jonah
friend
and the
Kate
whale
said,
happened.
that
As if
hoe
any
ain't
of these
real.
things.
Yes.
Jesus, that hoe ain't real. I can't say it as good as her, but shout out to Kate. If Kate's listening to this, shout out to Kate. I love you.
They're going to be coming after us with pitchforks. But it's all
I know,
good.
they really
already
will.
are in my Facebook comments. They're fun over there. But these when you persecute a woman, you're really just persecuting her for being a woman.
Yeah.
The witch trials weren't about anything supernatural. They weren't about anything spiritual. They were part of the counter revolution against the peasant uprising against feudalism. Because in that time when feudalism started to crumble, the money folks are like, well, this system isn't going to work. Well, we can't actually let peasants run the table because fuck that. So capitalism, the development of mercantile capitalism, this wage-based system, was a counter revolution to the fall of feudalism and the peasant uprisings. It didn't occur naturally. Like Adam Smith and the hand of God came down and said, capitalism, and boom, you're welcome. Like, no,
Right.
it didn't develop naturally. It was a very specific system that was implemented in order to make sure that they had a constant labor supply at the price that they were willing to pay, and they had enough babies. Because population concerns were a thing back in the day too, because the plague wiped out.
Thank you to these ladies. I love them so much. Please go follow their YouTube, This was on the Audacity podcast with YV Edit and The Sovereign Woman. They're on YouTube, featuring Therese. She is just a library of delicious feminist woman knowledge. Go check her out. I wanted to make this video because I feel a lot of women are waking up. Even I had my moment, my epiphany moment, when I realized the women that they were calling witches, the women that were killed, murdered, stoned, burned, all the things, drowned, your ancestors, women in my bloodline, women in our bloodlines who were just killed for no reason because they had plant knowledge, medicine knowledge, power, financial power, they had land. These women were killed, and all of that is in our DNA. This fear to be successful, this fear to be intelligent in different areas, to chase after these different avenues as women because of fear of the loss of your life. People will say, well, why don't women join STEM and do all these other things? Because it's literally in us that if we chase after these things, be business moguls, do all this stuff, it's literally in your DNA to be scared of this. And so I wanted to make this video, and we will talk more on these things. I hope I didn't offend anyone, because I know they touched on religious, but a lot of us are deconstructing even religion, and I want to touch more on these things. But this was for the ladies, to free yourself and to not be scared, because at the end of the day, even though I'm deconstructing my religious mindsets and the things that I've been taught, I will know that there are still good spirits and forces on this planet that do want to see you grow, want to see you succeed, want to see you do more. Your ancestors, God, whatever you believe in, is there for you to be free and be powerful, not to oppress you and keep you in fear. Anything that is here to oppress you and keep you in fear is not for you, is not truth. And so I will talk more on these things. I love you, ladies. Please go follow these women. I love them so much. And I'm just so grateful that they are here to instill in us this knowledge so that history doesn't repeat itself. History doesn't get rewritten and lies continue to permeate in people's minds. And the women who are here to help the children, women who are here to actually help women and people who are in need, are supported and protected. And that means you, whoever's watching this, this is for you. I love you ladies so much. Later.